Nobody works harder than me, period. The first sign that something went off was actually when I was much younger. My father had his own challenges and took his life, which was really sad and something that took the whole family a lot of time to recover from. I think I wasn't defined by my achievements. I was able to connect to something that was a bit more grounded and true and who I was, and ultimately find ways of working and performing for me that were more balanced and helpful. I have had to learn this over time. Work smarter, not harder. At peak, when I was battling all my demons, I was like 113 kilos. I'm sitting at about 88 now and feeling really fit.
Luke's a growth coach and consultant that works with startup founders. He's a former employee of Facebook and Google, author of 2 books, and proud spouse and father to 2 young twin boys. He's a mental health advocate and sits on the board of the charity SANE. You can learn more about him at lukemarshall.net.
Welcome back to Peak Performance Hacks, and I'm your host, Dr. Gan. Today I have an amazing guest, Luke Marshall, who's been in the tech industry for a very long time. He's previously worked with Facebook as well as Google, and now he's a dynamic growth coach and consultant, and he helps entrepreneurs and startup founders. He has also written and authored a couple of books and to essentially help entrepreneurs scale their business. And he's a father of twins, and he's got an amazing family life. But he's also passionate about mental health, and he's an advocate, having gone through mental health as well in his life. He currently sits on the board of the charity SANE, and he works to raise awareness and support for mental health issues. So today we're going to talk to Luke about his journey, his strategies for growth, and also what he does in terms of his mental well-being. How are you, Luke?
Feeling really good today, Gan. How are you?
I'm very good. Thanks for joining us today and for sharing some of this, because I think for a lot of people, having the openness to talk about mental health has been almost sort of a barrier in that space. So I'm really grateful that you're happy to share some of this with us today.
Look, it's a topic that I care about a lot, and the fact that I'm speaking here with you today, it has a happy ending, as you can tell by the smile on my face.
The happy ending is construed by many for different reasons, but we'll go with that. And with your mental health, and can you tell us a little bit more about how life has sort of transpired for you with your mental health and how you've got to this point?
Yeah, I'd say the role of mental health in my life has probably expanded and contracted over time. And I'd say growing up, my childhood up until university days, it was a blip. It wasn't something that was spoken about. Mental illness and mental health in general was pretty much taboo. I grew up in a rural country town called Traralgon, just in Gippsland. And so despite some of the dark things that happened in my childhood, the connection to sort of mental health and the impacts that can have wasn't really made. And then I'd say it expanded big time, and my learning curve for mental health went up dramatically, unfortunately, when I went to Perth and to study my second degree, and had a pretty spectacular psychotic episode, and eventually was arrested and hospitalized, and spent time in a hospital for 3 months. And that kind of hospital is known as a forensic hospital. It's one that happens when there's mental health challenges and also challenges with the law. And fortunately, I was able to resolve things, going through those systems during my time in Perth. It took a few months, but the recovery from such an incident and episode took a much longer time. And so, I've had to learn what works and what doesn't over that time. Fortunately, for me in my life, I think awareness of mental health has transformed over the last 20 years as well. And I think today, I'm in a fortunate position where I can sort of give back and help through my service through the board at SANE, but also I also volunteer in sort of recovery circles. So I help myself and others recover from trauma and childhood trauma, and that's an ongoing process that I'm very happy to do, and feel grateful and fortunate to be in a position that I can.
Wow, yeah. Well, it's quite a lot there, Mashi, and I think while you were telling me that, I was just thinking about how challenging and difficult that would have been for you, especially at a young age. But I wanted to unpack a little bit more. So when you, at the time when you were in Traralgon and you, I'm assuming in your as a teenager, was this something that your family recognized that was happening already, or how did it sort of come about?
Yeah, I guess it's quite funny today looking back on it with the 2020 hindsight, because there's obvious things that are obvious now that weren't obvious back then. And I think that the first sign that something went off was actually when I was much younger, when I was 4 years old. My father had his own challenges and took his life, which was really sad and something that took the whole family a lot of time to recover from. And then I think the coping behaviors that you develop to sort of recover from something like that without the right supports. For me, it was sort of going more into my own shell, embracing things like high performance and perfectionism, and really pushing myself to please others and what was happening in the external world. And, as a teenager, that presented as high academic performance. I got a scholarship to another school in late high school. I actually sailed through university, my undergrad degree, got an internship at the Herald Sun, high marks, was able to transfer into law, for my second degree. And I think those coping behaviors I mentioned about sort of, pushing myself and trying to please others is probably what led to the psychotic episode. And unfortunately, we can see now, probably in the years leading up, that there were ups and downs and sort of, things were careening out of control. But at the time, awareness of this was really low, and probably not in my favor either. Was that when I relocated to Perth, all my checks, balances, support network, friends, family who might have noticed that my behavior was starting to go a bit askew, weren't there either. And so, what happened, and it was a really challenging time and event. I think with what I know now, I consider myself lucky that it wasn't worse. Seriously, physical harm could have been done to me myself as well. But I'm okay talking about this stuff because it's important to share your story where you can and where you're comfortable doing so. Because if another person who might be going through a rough or similar time hears it, then that reduces the stigma and makes what they're feeling okay too. And I think and believe that's really important.
Thank you for sharing that, because obviously that I'm just assuming that anyone hearing this, that would be so helpful for them to feel like they're not alone, and especially someone who has done so well. I did have a question about that, because oftentimes with sort of high achievers and peak performers, they're always pushing themselves to the limit. And in your case, you use that as a coping mechanism for what had happened with your dad, and also how you would cope with your emotions internally. When would you say you recognized that this was becoming a problem, or did you recognize it when you were in between Perth and doing your various degrees?
I think for me, it was an ongoing evolution of awareness around this. And I'd say after my immediate recovery from what happened in Perth, I was chasing that original feeling. I used to call it the year 12 feeling, where I felt invincible. I could, do well in sort of all areas, athletically and in career and performance. And I probably got there a few years later, where I'd sort of stabilized my mental health, had started some sort of non-career jobs just to get things going. And then my career in marketing and advertising really took off. And I started embracing that push hard, play hard mentality again. And I thought I was okay. And it wasn't until much later and sort of going through this pushy path that I realized those traits I talked about, like perfectionism and sort of striving to please others, were starting to no longer serve me even in my career, which is sort of something that I identified with really heavily. And what was really good about this realization is that things started to feel like they clicked again, because by recognizing that I wasn't defined by my achievements, I was able to connect to something that was a bit more grounded and true, and who I was, and ultimately find ways of working and performing for me that were more balanced and helpful. And what I love about talking in a forum like this is, um, you know, it's not that the high performance things are good or bad. They work for some people and work for others, and certainly worked for me for a very long time. And I think what I had to temper was high performance all the time, and realize that I can't redline, and was able to temper it with much more self-nurturing and sort of being kind to myself traits that have helped me grow into a more full and aware person that is an evolution from where I was, rather than trying to chase that year 12 feeling that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that you just hit on such an important point. It's you just can't continue to redline. And I think for a lot of people hearing this, it's the fact that they think that they can physically and mentally outperform everyone else if they just continue the hustle culture and just keep pushing. And at some point, if you don't have recovery, you're going to end up in a position where it's you've gone beyond that red line, and now you're going to have to work to trying to get back. And so if you well, that's an amazing story, Marshy. I think the fact that you've recovered from that, you've even seen the light on the other side, and you've been kind to yourself. When did you think that sort of hit in?
Yeah, I think it started hitting in probably about 10 or 12 years ago, around the time that I was working for a great company at Google. I had this goal to write this book about my experiences, and realized that some things needed to change. And it was around that time that I discovered meditation. And meditation my practice has evolved over time, but the seeds of that connecting to something or being a bit more aware or what was going on in my mind was sown then. And then I think, to be honest, the next step change probably happens during COVID, because around that time, I lived in Melbourne. It was a very rough time for a lot of people living here because the lockdowns are so intense. And I was having beers on the couch. I'm like, why am I doing this? This doesn't even do anything for me anymore. I'm not enjoying this. And I'd flirted with sobriety in the past, like a dry July here, 90 days here, even 6 months at one point. I'm like, we're done. And shortly after sort of going into sobriety for the full time, I started getting become more aware of recovery and recovery principles, and started the real deeper work on sort of trauma and really connecting with my inner child and things like that, which it's been an amazing journey and something that I feel really grateful for. But when I was looking at it originally, I'm like, wow, what is this woo-woo stuff? But actually, over time, I've come to know that these tools and sort of how it works has helped me become a more fuller and aware person. And, I had kissed becoming a father goodbye pretty much. And to have, twin boys now is just beyond wildest dreams come true.
With the alcohol that you mentioned you've given up, did you think that it was ever a problem for you?
Yeah, I've toed and froed on this, Gan. I used to wonder around the term addict, or I've had some bad nights, but I'm not like this person. And where I've arrived is it ultimately doesn't matter, because in my day job and sort of marketing world, and it's very data led. And so, we look at sort of control group and sort of exposed group. And if I look at life pre and post, sure, I had to work through some dark healing stuff on the inside in that first year, first and foremost. But in doing so, and by not having a numbing agent attached to it, each year has gotten significantly better year on year. And life, it wasn't like life was terrible before. It's like, wow, it gets even better. And so for me, getting access to that improvement is amazing. And also not have and realizing I can fill what I used to spend my time with that on in other areas like service and writing and creative pursuits, and even basketball. Like I love basketball. I was able to return to that as an older adult. I just don't see why I would ever go back. And am I able to connect some of the problems I had to alcohol? Potentially, but more importantly, by letting go of alcohol, it cleared the space to be able to work through the problems that were already there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. And I think, I mean, I never used to drink a lot. I think I used to have those spurts where I'm also on the weekends, I'll go crazy. And then, and when there's time to, on holidays. But then over the years, I've reduced my alcohol to the point that I pretty much don't enjoy it as much as I used to, because it's, I've got young kids as well. And so the next day is not ever fun. So I'm happy to give it up. But it's interesting that a lot of people don't see it that way, because I think when you talk about giving up alcohol, for some people, it's almost like you're telling them that they shouldn't continue to have fun anymore, and you're sort of boring, and you go down that track. And I think, and correct me if I'm mistaken, but in the marketing world, it is not uncommon for people to drink quite a bit as well at functions and constantly at events.
Oh yeah, marketing and advertising world, and I'd probably add another world in there called agency world.
Yes.
It's very much a work hard, play hard culture, and clients in years gone by, I had alcohol clients, and so we'd have access to parties and sort of a
Yes.
lot of free booze. And as someone who's sort of not necessarily getting paid extraordinarily well, but getting invited to a lot of events with free alcohol, it's a very easy pattern to fall into. And I think it was definitely normalized in the years that I was sort of rising up the career ladder. And what I've noticed about younger generations coming through is that it's less embedded. One of my last agency roles, there was the Friday night drinks, but actually some of the feedback we saw was that the younger people didn't necessarily want to get wasted. One, it was in front of their boss, but more importantly for some of them, two, it can be captured on social media. And I'm like,
exactly.
well, if that's a reason and it helps them live a healthier life, so be it.
Yeah. It's interesting because even now, when you look at all the superstars, and you know this, that I'm a big basketball fan myself. I like your slow motion basketball videos that you like doing. And when you look at all the basketball stars, that's the first thing they say. Like, back in the day, you could never get caught what you're doing outside of basketball. But right now, you got someone recording you at every moment.
Yeah, it's high stakes.
You currently work with a lot of founders and obviously entrepreneurs in the field. Do you come across what you described earlier with the pressures and the coping mechanisms? I think with a lot of high performers, this is a very common theme. And so, do you find that with the people that you're working with, do you see this, and how do you bring it to their attention when they're there talking to you about how to improve themselves from a business perspective?
Yeah, it's a keen observation, and a lot of founders will see it, particularly first-time founders, will see it as their edge. Speaking back to agency people for a brief second, there's an author of a book that had this attitude of hustle culture, that the quote was, "Nobody works harder than me, period," as if that's something to be proud of. And I have had to learn this over time: work smarter, not harder. And as someone who burnt the candle at both heads and know what redlining looks like, it's easier to see it in other people. And if these are clients or people I'm working with, a message that I give them might land favorably with one and not the other. And so what I've noticed over time is I can't tell them what to do or what not to do, and it's probably not my business. But what I can suggest are things that have worked for me in the past, because I know they're proven to be true, and I know they can net better outcomes. And so some of the things I've tried is sort of, mentioning recovery and seeing if that's of interest to them, mentioning sobriety. Other times, I'm also a small investor in an alcohol-free beer company called Sober, and so sometimes that resonates. But how I like to link it, if that's not getting through, I try and link it to the outcome thereafter. So, if you're going to grow a company and sort of achieve some of the milestones that you're seeking, preserving yourself along the way, the number one asset is going to be critical. And so there's some interesting thoughts on this, but finding outlets that can help release some of that edge is going to be super useful. And I am quite an authentic person and don't mind talking about personal life and business life and letting it blend. But I know not everyone's like that. So ultimately, when I'm working with people, you've got to sort of find the style that suits for them, the groove, and help them resonate and thrive in the groove they're choosing to roll in.
Yeah. And I think I recently listened to this, and I think a big thing that's been coming out is that a lot of people feel that the older generation, so people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who have already sort of made it, are talking about work-life balance. But then a lot of younger people are saying that when you were in your 20s, you in your 30s, you were working and crushing it really hard. And now that once you've kind of made it, you have the ability to tell people that, oh, you should. So it's almost like an old person telling a young person that maybe you shouldn't work so hard, and for a young person to think that you're just old, that's what you're saying. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, it's almost like an okay boomer mentality. And I think the counter to this, I heard a really good term from a friend who worked, he might still be there, works at Facebook, and he absolutely is a high performer. Like he goes about it in a great way. And he introduced me to the term called tilting. And so tilting isn't necessarily work-life balance. But when you're choosing to work in a particular area, you'll tilt into that area and push the envelope, fully understanding that you're going to tilt back at other times. And so instead of it being everything's balanced, at all at once, which is probably, a bit of a misnomer anyway, it's more, okay, when I'm working, I'm really working, but when I'm resting, I'm really resting. And for him, those noticing the edges and pushing into them really worked for him. And it resonated with me as well. And the other thing that I do a lot of is sort of long distance running. And I think that's gone through a transformation in the last 5 to 15 years as well, because the training isn't necessarily going as fast as you can in every workout. Zone 2 and sort of 80-20 and other principles have started to arise. And my own experience with Zone 2 is once you get used to it, it makes running a lot easier and more sustainable.
Yeah, that's true, actually. And I just thought about this in terms of what you told me, I think, which is great, the tilting. But you mentioned earlier it was sort of work hard, party hard, work hard. So with tilting, it's almost like work hard and rest hard rather than you just kind of minus the partying, I guess. And so we discussed sort of, you working in founders and finding that, you try to, as much as you're trying to help them grow and develop, you're looking out for features where they're sort of overworking. Do you find, like, in terms for yourself, do you think there is a balance?
I think balance means different things for different people and different life stages. I think with what I know now of what it's like to be in your 20s, I took some big risks. Like I relocated to Singapore as a 27-year-old for a career opportunity. And, at the time, my mental health was what was good, and but the specter of what happened earlier and what I shared was still hanging over my head. And so I rolled the dice and sort of took that opportunity and didn't have any responsibilities at the time. I was a single male, keen to explore the world. And I'd say it paid off. Like, I got exposure to amazing career opportunities and clients. And would I make such a move, as someone who's older now with more responsibilities? No, probably not. And I think balance for me, though, comes back to that comment I made about sort of the external world and the internal world. And I'm measuring myself by what I know of my internal world. And so to me, balance means honoring that and respecting what my body and feelings and sort of connection to myself is telling me. And so that goes awry when I start, say, responding to external stimuli or over identifying it. But when I'm guided by my inner compass, I would say, balance is always in tow as well.
I think that's a great way to think about it. But what about that person who's listening and thinking, I'm being lazy by not pushing myself? How do you counter that? Because I'm sure myself being a high achiever, a high performer, you always have that person sitting on your shoulder saying, you worked hard, you pushed hard, you got here, and you can outwork everyone, like you mentioned earlier. How do you counter that when you're saying, are you being lazy now, or are you just choosing to be restful, or how do you do that? How do you manage that?
It's a great question, and one that I've done that wrestle for in the past. And if I had to, hear that voice that's saying you're being lazy, you're not pushing yourself hard enough, the label I'd give to that is my inner critic. And my inner critic, was the main voice driving me to push and be perfect and push really hard and push my limits. I understand why the inner critic was doing those things, because that's the way they saw. And now today, when that voice rears its head, I'm like, thank you, but I actually know other ways I can get to where I'm going that don't require me to think of myself as lazy. And a really strong turning point in my recovery, was earlier in my 30s, and I was sitting at the dinner table with my ex, and she asked, would you ever talk to anyone else like you talk to yourself? And I looked at her like she had three heads and was a gorgon. I'm like, absolutely not. Do you hear how harsh I could be? I could be talking to myself. And that's when reality set in. I'm like, well, why aren't I my own best friend? I actually can let that go and be okay. But it takes time, because if that voice has been pushing for a very long time, we'd sometimes mistake that as being our own voice.
Yeah, and I think I really enjoyed that smarter, not harder. I think as you generally, as you get a bit older, you want to be in a position that you've pushed hard in your mental capacity as well as physically, and you want to get to that point where you're at that sweet spot where I don't want to use the word balance, but you're choosing which day and how you're going to feel to decide what you do next as well. I have a part of this segment which I call walk the talk, and essentially I want to go through for yourself in terms of your health. And you've made such such an amazing storyline behind having gone through what you've gone through. How do you take care of your health now, and do you sort of walk the talk, especially when you're working with these founders and entrepreneurs who are early startups, and sort of being the model to them in terms of health as well?
Yeah, I love that this is a segment, and I do walk the talk, Gun, and it's evolved over time. So I don't recommend anything I wouldn't do myself, and I think that's really important. The things I do sort of from a weekly basis that I think in terms of walking the talk, and I wouldn't recommend all of these combinations to people. It's just what works for me. I have cold showers every day and have for over 7 or 8 years. I've stopped counting because this is just my way of life now. I meditate daily, usually in the morning, and try as well at night with a practice that resonates with me. I train 4 to 5 times a week. I will never skip. I'll never have two non-training days more than 2 non-training days in a row because I find it doesn't work for me. Another big one is phone. I will sleep with it in the other room because I have ADHD. I'm too tempted to reach for the screen and go and scroll distracto mode if it's in the bedside near me. So I'm quite happy doing that. And I think I really eat clean Monday to Friday. Like it's sort of like monk mode, just no processed foods, vegetables, proteins, eggs, vegetables, protein, and meat. And then I'll fast for lunch because that helps me with focus during my working week. And the funny thing is, then on the weekend, it's not cheat weekend. I find that's not quite but I just let it go. I'm not tracking. If I want to have pizza one night, I do. Like it's not a thing. And that it took a really long time to get the combination away that works for me, but I'm actually sort of back to my weight that I was near university time. And at peak when I was battling all my demons, I was like 113 kilos. I'm sitting at about 88 now and feeling really fit. So, I think, there's that saying about doers do and teachers teach. I disagree with that one because there's a lot of experience you can glean from heeding a coach or a teacher. But if they're, not walking the walk as well in some way, shape, or form, it's probably a flag.
Exactly. I think it was Zig Ziglar. I reckon he, in one of his talks, he sort of mentioned that if you go and see a doctor and he's overweight, you should immediately walk out and run out that door because he's not going to give you the right advice. Which is it's a hard pill to swallow, and but at the same point, it's true. I believe a lot of, including a lot of medical people who advise their patients, probably don't do the same. And a lot of my friends and colleagues in the medical world generally don't eat well because we're too busy. We miss our meals, and when we do eat, it's actually probably not nutritious food anyway. So I think I try to look at myself in a mirror and sort of reflect if I'm giving this advice to someone else, just like you mentioned earlier that your inner critic being completely mean to you. I think I try to think about the same thing for myself as well. And interestingly, I'll share with you the story. I had someone in the medical field that I was actually treating, and she happened to actually start feeling dizzy and feel sick. And but then when it happened, she just overreacted to the point that she wanted to get up immediately, and she felt that she was actually going to burden me by being in that position. And I just said, you need to just relax. What would you tell your patient? And she said, I would tell them exactly what you're saying. I need to just lay down and relax. And it's really hard to hear, especially when you've been in the field and you feel that you don't want to actually be that person that's difficult. And so I like the fact that you mentioned that you play basketball, and you mentioned that you were quite athletic when you were younger. When did the basketball start to pop up again in terms of as you got older?
Yeah, I love that you asked that question, Gan, because it resonated with the time I started connecting to my inner child. And so as a teenager and in primary school, I played a lot of basketball. We had a basketball ring in our driveway. I just loved it. And then for whatever reason, 15, 16, I didn't quite shoot up height-wise enough, and I let it go, and then discovered uni, partying and all that, and it never came back. And I think little Luke missed that. And so once I started this work, I started hitting the court and shooting hoops. And then I got more and more confident with it and started recording myself and doing the slow motion videos you sort of referred to. And then a few seasons ago, joined an older team. And we had our second win last week. We don't win very often, but loved it. And it's good having something regular, routine-led and team-based that as an older adult that I just love.
Yes. And I'm glad you actually touched on that, because I think, especially for a lot of men and for any man that's actually listening to this, I think the social connections for men is very different from the social connections of women. I think women tend to keep friends, and they spend a lot of time with keeping close connections, and even people that are not close, they kind of put the effort for it. But I think for men, and especially in your industry and with working with tech founders, a lot of them, they just put their head down, they keep working, and oftentimes they lose those relationships. What do you think about that? And how do you help founders, for example, manage that as well?
Yeah, I think it's starting to shift a little bit. Like, because the default in tech used to be pizza and beers networking, and that was it. And I think there's a lot more awareness led events or events where alcohol isn't the focus. And one that's been operating by a couple of circles in tech is basketball, actually, funnily enough. And so there's a
Yes.
basketball networking and tech mixer down here in Victoria, but they're also happening up in Sydney and even Brisbane, run by a few people that are great community connectors. And so that's been really fun, meeting like-minded individuals who enjoy fitness, work in tech and want to do something other than eat pizza and drink beer. And
Yeah.
probably the only interesting but not surprising thing that happens at these events, they're generally high performers. So you can imagine how competitive it gets on the courts as well.
Which is probably a good thing, actually. It's funny because you mentioned I love basketball even since I was a kid. And one of the things that I did was, this was even before my kids were born, was that I sort of made a small little mini court, and it was sort of a half court. And I told my wife that it's actually for the kids, but really it was for my inner child that never had that. And it's one of the best things for me because I feel like sometimes when I'm just shooting around, it just clears my head and I feel completely relaxed. It's like the best thing for me. And I think for a lot of people, sort of finding that, especially as a man, finding that hobby that they used to love, for example, basketball, where we're talking, but even something that they enjoyed and not just, leaving it out there where you're just constantly just working and not connecting with friends, not connecting with people. I think that's a very important thing that often gets lost.
Absolutely. It fills your cup.
And so, Marshy, thank you so much for today. Before we end, I just wanted to get a bit more information about the SANE project, SANE, that you work for, and just get a bit more information about that for our listeners.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gan. SANE is a charity that supports people living with complex mental health, which generally is people who sort of identify that way or have comorbidities or multiple things going on, or just finding life really, really hard. And one of the things SANE does and offers is the guided service program, because what we found is people going through the mental health system, perhaps for the first time, they can get clinical support, but might need help with all the other areas of their life. And so with SANE's guided service program, they can work with a peer support worker or a counsellor to help handhold them through that process, which might be helping you find a job, helping you find a new place to live, and things like that. And it's all safe and managed online, and sort of you're guided through the process. And that's available to anyone 18 plus and within the registered PHNs. And you can just check that by entering your postcode on the website, sane.org.
And this is Australia-wide?
Yeah, Australia-wide. There's just funding is restricted to a number of locations with the postcodes, but it's easy to check. And we were in Canberra earlier this year trying to get the funding to be nationalised, which hopefully it will be soon.
That's amazing. Well, I would like to just sort of say how grateful I am that you actually shared your story. I think it takes a lot of courage and obviously a lot of insight on your part. And you've obviously been through a lot of hardship and you've come out the other end. And I think a lot of people hearing this, because for a lot of people, I think talking about it is hard. And for people to hear this and know that they're not alone, I think that's a great place to start. So thanks a lot, Marshy. And if people want to find you, where can they find you?
Yeah, the best place to find me is either on LinkedIn, where I post a lot, or my website, just lukemarshall.net. And if you're a founder or curious about what I do, there's a Start Here page, which gives you all sorts of things you can do if you want to get some help.
Perfect. Well, thanks a lot, Marshy.
Thanks for having me, Gun.
This wraps up this episode of Peak Performance Hacks. All the links and resources are in the video description or in the resource section, whether it is on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a review so that more people can discover our podcast and it could benefit them as well. Until I catch you next time, speak soon.